I've been asked to go through a few slides on soil fertility. The challenge for this spring. All the talk is about the price of fertilizer, and so when we're putting out fertilizer with the cost, we need to ensure that where it's going and what you're putting out is not wasted. So the basis of all soil fertility is taking soil samples. So the starting point is having enough soil samples on your farm to give us the knowledge of what's in the ground. So the new metric for measuring everything to do with nutrients is nutrient use efficiency. So this is a slide that say David Wall helped put together, and we can see they've all put together, and we can see on the y-axis over here, it's based on the return, or the amount of return on, if we put out 100 kilograms of nitrogen, the return we're finding from those 100 kilograms of nitrogen. On the x-axis, we have it if we improve soil fertility. So what's really telling us is that if we start with a soil that's low for phosphorus, low for pH, and low for K, where our return on nutrient use efficiency on after putting out 100 kilograms of nitrogen on the grassland is low. It's coming in at something like 35%. And if we improve our different elements of soil fertility, our pH and phosphorus, our P's and K's, and we reach an optimum pH, P and K, our return on nutrient use efficiencies is an average of 65%. So we're looking to increase, by improving soil fertility, we're looking to increase our nutrient use by approximately 30%. So the first element on that we're going to look at then is our optimum pH. So everybody knows that lime is how we solve our pH problems. That like farmers, and even say politicians know about it. In 1940, there was 1,270 pounds given to the farmers in Wexford to try and improve lime. So it's been going on for years. We can see why we need to keep putting lime out is on the bottom here. We're saying we're losing lime every year through drainage. So we're losing an average of 500 kilograms of lime a year, 500 kilograms per hectare per year of lime. And if we break that down, it works out at something like 200 kilograms per acre. Likewise up here, when we put out chemical nitrogen, every 100 kilograms of chemical nitrogen that goes out, we're losing about 200 kilograms of lime. So if a irrigation farmer was allowed to put out 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, again, we're losing 500 kilograms of lime per hectare, which is equivalent to 200 kilograms per acre. So without doing anything, each year we're losing at least 0.4 of a ton of lime. And then we have the other offtakes from in beef and milk and in silage. So if we go along and soil sample every 4 years, we're more or less losing a minimum of 1.6 tons of lime in the 4 years. So it's back to our old recommendation was roughly put out 2 tons of lime every time we sample, which was every 3 or 4 years. So it falls in line with what we have been doing. Now, there was 2 clients who spoke to me recently, and one of them was last October, and they said, what can we do with the high price of fertilizer? And the first thing we said, we'll try put out lime. And the response I got was amazing. The return on the lime was instant. So we don't have to wait. If it goes out, you'll see a response. There's no time lag. Likewise, there's another client who asked me about soil sampling this year, and he was looking to soil sample to find the pH. So he wanted to get the pH right for clover. So he was like a tillage crop. He was going to try and sow a crop of clover this year. So the pH for clover is a bit higher, about 6.7. So that's what he was targeting this year, to use lime to benefit his clover. So it was great to hear from 2 farmers trying to do 2 different things, but lime was the key. So if we come, our second one here, then we said we look at optimum pH and P and what difference that'll make to our nutrient use efficiency. This is a very simple slide, but what's telling us that if we don't have our pH correct, we're wasting our time putting out phosphorus. We can see here it when we have acidic soils that the P is being wrestled away from us by aluminium and iron. So Fe and Al. So if we're going to put phosphorus out, we need to correct our pH first. If not, we're wasting our time. This is, again, it's a slide that we keep using, but on the x-axis, again, we have the units of phosphorus, and on the y-axis, we have tons of grass grown, and in the boxes, we have the soil index. So again, what it's showing is that the lower P index, index 1 being very low, index 2 being low, and index 3 being our target, we can see that we can, at the lower index, we're growing the least amount of grass. So trying to get our optimal response to inputs and trying to offset, trying to grow as much grass as we can, we're looking to try and raise the indices from index 1 or 2 up to 3. Now, that sounds very simple, but if we got from index 1 to index 3, it's about an extra 4 bales of silage per acre that we should be able to grow. But it sounds very simple to be able to raise the P levels, but it takes an extremely long time to raise P levels. That it takes about 50 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare, which is 40 units per acre, to try and not raise an index, but just raise a unit. So like if we're down at level our unit 2 and we want to get up to unit 6, like that's roughly 4 years putting out this 50 kilograms per hectare. And like I can't see many farmers being in a position this year to put out that amount of phosphorus, because the price of phosphorus at the moment is something like €3.69 a kilo. So it'll be very hard to see anyone being able to meet this requirement to try and rise the P levels. This is just limits wise. So this is back to it for index 1, the amount of phosphorus we're allowed to try and raise the limits. But if we come over here to index 3, which is maintenance, this is 19 kilograms per hectare here, which is 15 units per acre. So that's maintenance at this stocking rate. So like if you have fields at index 1 and index 2 for phosphorus, we can't afford to take a holiday, a phosphorus holiday. We still have to put out at least maintenance. So if that's 15 units per acre, if a bag of 18612 has 6 units, so that's 2 bags of 18612 2 6s would be 12 units, or 3 bags of 18612 3 6s would be 18 units. So we're looking at someplace between 2 and 3 bags per acre just for maintenance on these derogation type farms. So like we can't afford to take that holiday on on the low indices. So the last one is potassium. So the good news, potassium is required because it's used in protein synthesis, and if we don't have potassium, it works hand in hand with nitrogen. So if our potassium is low, we're not going to get the efficiency from nitrogen. So we can't do without potassium. The next one is, the good news about potassium is that we can raise it fairly quickly, the levels. It responds quickly. So slurry is high in K. So if we can target our slurry around the farm, on our silage fields and on our grazing ground fields, we're able to alter the K levels in our fields reasonably quickly. Now, if you're exporting slurry off the farm, well, then it gets much more trickier, like if we're putting it on maize ground. But if we can recycle it around the farm and we have enough of it, which David will be talking about later on, we should be able to manage K. So the last slide here this is a very simple slide to follow and a great slide to look at. It's basically off our nutrient management plan, our page 2 of our nutrient management plan. So it breaks down the soil results into pie charts, and we can see here the first pie chart says on this farm, this is newly taken samples. On the first pie chart says there's no soils here at optimum index for pH, P and K. Usually there's some fields, but in this case there's nothing. In this one here for pH, we can see there's 93% of the farm, 94% of the farm is optimum for pH. Now, they say that's not surprising. This farmer's put out over 240 tons of lime 2 years ago. So whether that was to build soil, pH, or to hold it, you can see what it's done. It has the soils where we want it. This is the problem on this farm, is that the levels of phosphorus is low. The whole farm is index 1 or index 2. So that mightn't be the farmer's fault. He could be trying his best to raise the levels. Like we said, it takes years, a lot of money and plenty of planning to try and raise the P levels. So the minimum we need there again is our maintenance requirement. And the last pie chart is to do with potassium. And we can see again, the whole farm is ideal for potassium. So again, potassium can be worked on and improved as per the previous slide with our slurries and fertilizers. So the last one here is this box here. It explains what these pie charts mean. And on this farm, there's a 15% reduction in capacity, we say, to grow grass to produce on the farm. So if I got 15% less from my change from a shopkeeper, I'd be disappointed. So, and I wouldn't be going back. So 15% does mean a lot, and that's what we need to try and improve. So to finish up, Paul, my learnings again from 2 clients, the response to lime is instant and it works. We should look to build pH for our future crops of clover as the nitrogen limits come down, and we can't afford a holiday from phosphorus on the lower indices soils. So Paul, that's it.
Great stuff, Martin. Listen, thanks very much for that. We just before we go to questions, if you'd like to turn off those captions appearing on your screen, there's a transcript button at the bottom of your screen. You can turn off the captions. We might just go to Kevin there now and just see have we any questions.
Yeah, Mark, there's a few questions in there. I suppose the first one, have the Department of Agriculture sent out the results from the soil sampling program? I was sampled at the end of November, but still haven't got the results. That's just the first one in there.
Yeah, I was talking to a client this evening, and I think he was one of the first that were taken around the Enniscorthy area, and he got his results shortly after Christmas. That was the normal P's and K's. The soil organic matter and the E. coli are not back yet because they have to go to England. But yes, farmers have got the results back. Some of them have, yeah.
Oh, just another question in there, Martin, is what is the value of slurry to build P and K indexes?
If I leave that for David will be covering. David has that figure at the end, or either David or Colin are covering the fertility bit. Sorry, the fertilizer bit at the end, if that's all right.
That's no problem. There's another question in there as well, Martin. I suppose, how is kilos of fertilizer worked out from units and bags?
So if we have kilos per hectare, so we 19 kilos per hectare multiplied by 0.8, that'll give us units per acre. And we'll say every bag we're looking at, we'll count them as being units. So if you put out a bag of 18,612, there's 18 units going out, the 6 units of phosphorus going out, and 12 units of K. So we can make it very complicated because we'll just go with, we'll say the bags are units and multiply it, then the number of bags will give us the amount of units going out. If you can follow that, Kevin.
And there's just one final one there, Martin, I suppose. Is it too late to go with lime now, or even later in the spring, especially on silage ground?
Okay, let me think. So the lime, okay, so we say on grazing ground, the problem is if we don't want our stock taking a lot of lime up off the grassland. So again, that depends on rainfall and your rotation. Likewise, for your silage, if we have lime on the silage in the pit, the pH won't drop and we won't make silage. So whenever we put out lime this spring on silage ground, we have to be happy that the lime will be washed into the soil. So I'm told there's less rain falling this month, only 25% or something of our average. So as the weather goes, we're taking a chance to get the lime washed off, but I presume mid-February, I'd say with the current weather, or the end of February is the latest for putting lime onto silage ground.
Yeah, that's it, Martin. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks very much, Martin. We'll move on now, and Colin, you're set up there now, Colin? Yep, I can see it. Optimum use of slurry. Yep, that's on the screen.
Yeah, lovely job. So thanks, Paul. So my section will be optimum use of slurry. So hopefully we can go through it reasonably quick. So basically we could ask what's in our slurry, and Martin had just used the example of what's a bag of fertilizer and what units are they. So I don't want to confuse it too much, and I don't want to bog down too much into figures, but basically 1,000 gallons of slurry, the table there is comparing the amount of units in 1,000 gallons. So you could call that for an indoor slatted slurry tank, it's equivalent to a bag of 6,541. That's how much units are in it. So if we're putting out 2,000 gallons to the acre, that's double that figure, and so on there. Like, so if we're looking at that, basically the principle that I want to get across here is that probably the more important thing to bear in mind is the actual dry matter content has the bigger impact here, rather than the type of tank it is or the type of animals that are in there. So the more dilute the slurry is with water, the less units are going to be there available. So what we'd be kind of saying there is that, look, if there's no point in denying now that a lot of farmers have tanks that are kind of approaching full and want to relieve pressure on tanks before calving starts and that. And we're quite cold in temperature still, and the response kind of isn't quite there for ideal grass growing conditions. So what we'd be looking towards is, can we put out our more dilute slurry now if there's soiled water tanks or that to say relieve pressure, that essentially there's less risk of loss of the nutrients put out, simply because putting them out now, we have to wait a long time for the growth to come to use those nutrients. Whereas if we could hold them till March, say the stronger slurry, if that could be held until March, it would be a lot better used. So the principle there, more or less, is that the more dilute the slurry is, the less nutrients there are. So basically, we can say the slurry can be tested. It can go to a lab, or a slurry hydrometer, basically the tool that's in the bottom right-hand corner there, can be used, and advisors are equipped with those. So if you want to test it, if you want slurry tested or that, give us a call. Basically, the other next reasonably big matter that I'd bear in mind is that here we have comparison between our types of slurry applications, our low emission slurry spreading, our dribble bar, trailing shoe and injection on the right. But basically there's two elements to this. First of all is that if we spread slurry in the spring versus spreading it in the summer, it's milder weather, the risk of losses to the atmosphere are a lot less. So one thing that would be saying here is that, first of all, we should be targeting to spread our slurry in the spring. And second of all, we should be treating low emission slurry spreading as a given, with the kind of the fertilizer cost we have, and just getting bang for your buck right now. Like, so just two things there: spread in the spring and use low emission slurry spreading equipment. So a few basics there, but where to spread then probably comes in the plan before deciding when to spread. So Martin had said there, and I had mentioned that your soil analysis and fertilizer plan is definitely something to bear in mind. You want to be targeting your P's and K's is the main elements or nutrients that are in slurry. So they want to be targeted to our kind of weak P and K indexes. But on top of that, there was a question that came in the last one to Martin: what does P and K do to build indexes? And we could say fairly, might be a way around saying this, but P and K from slurry isn't on your farm to build indexes. it's only there to recycle what you're after taking off in silage. So silage takes a lot of P and K off this field that you cut. Whereas when you're grazing, a lot of the P and K that is grazed by the cows, they're returning it themselves and recycling it. With silage, we're taking all the P and K and the grass off, and the only way we can recycle it is by putting the slurry back on. So realistically, the biggest draw of P and K is from our silage ground. The best nutrient that's balanced to go back on it is our slurry. So our slurry should be going on our silage ground. So we want to take account of how much slurry we want for our silage applications. And if we reckon we'd have some to spare, then we'd be using slurry to replace, say, an early chemical fertilizer application, say in our first round on the grazing platform. And then as well as that, like we'd be looking at kind of rates at 2,500 gallons to the acre are plenty. And around this time of the year, when say we're at the stage where we have tanks that we want to relieve pressure on, go with dilute slurry and go with a lower, say definitely below 2,000 gallons to the acre to give a lower nutrient load. To just, the requirement isn't quite there yet, and it's less nutrients to be lost to the environment as well. When to spread then, basically we want our soil temperature to be 6 degrees and rising. So we mightn't be quite there yet on just conditions that we have there. We have a soil thermometer. A soil thermometer is a very quick and useful tool to monitor what it's like on your farm. As well, it's obvious enough we want soil to be trafficable so that we can travel on it. We avoid areas at risk of waterlogging. Weather forecast, we want no heavy rain for 4 or 5 days ahead of us. And we want to be putting out fertilizer
slurry when we have grass growing able to use it. So one way to monitor that is if you measure yourself, you'll get a gauge of it. But as well as that, Grass 10 publish newsletters each week with predicting growth rates. And that's also on the Sunday farming weather forecast. As well as that, we could say that low grass covers, it's not a lack of nutrients that's holding them back, it's a lack of sunlight. So until grass is there to actually start kicking off, maybe we should be holding back our fertilizer. So I'll kind of just quickly wrap up. Now we have weather data available. This I'm drawing from the Agricultural Catchments Programme weather website, which there's a catchment quite near us, Ballycanoe, which there's weather data nearly every hour updated. So basically what I'm looking here, and that's at acpmet.ie. What we're looking at here is soil temperature. The dotted line is our 6 degrees where grass growth starts. Our arrow is pointing to where we are now. So we're not quite there as regards having the conditions right for fertilizer. And if we look over the winter as well, and we could debate on, close periods. What we're looking at the close period around December, and that we're looking at low soil temperatures and we're looking at high rainfall events. It's kind of not the time that we want slurry to be going out. And so that's the previous winter. If we actually look forward here, basically looking at weekly rainfall in Ballycanoe, basically you can see that around February time, there was high rainfall each week in the last 2 years, in 2020 and in 2021. And it's kind of as we get into March, our evapotranspiration or our drying potential increases. And also from the 1st of March, our soil temperature starts to increase. And that's 2 years data. It's the general trend has been high rainfall in February and soil temperature not really increasing until the 1st of March. So if we could nearly make our own conclusions about that. So I'll say one very last thing in that probably the best way to spread our slurry is to actually have our animals out grazing. So less labor, better cow performance, all that sort of stuff. So don't forget that one way to do best way of slurry spreading is to
have them out grazing. So thanks. And if there's any questions there, welcome.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much there, Colm. I'll hand over to Kevin there now for any questions that may be in.
Yeah, there's a few questions in there, Colm. I suppose the first one there is, where can you buy a slurry hydrometer?
So
hydrometer, sorry.
Yeah. This came up in another webinar, and basically in those two sites there now. So Martin Sykes and Bob Painting. And the tricky thing about this is that they're both in the UK. So getting deliveries over of them might be tricky. But that's where they can be sourced at the minute. So if you scribble down the notes of them and possibly or put them into Google, you should be able to find them.
And also, Kevin, also we have one in each of the Teagasc offices there at the moment if people want their slurry tested.
Yeah, no bother. I suppose another question in there is, what is the ideal dry matter content of slurry to spread using a dribble bar? And I suppose as well as that column, when is the best time to spread, I suppose, dilution and watery slurry? Kind of, it's all underneath the one there, I suppose.
Yeah, so look, the ideal time to spread it is when we have our growing conditions right. And that's a simple, not simple answer, in that when we have our growing conditions stacking up is our best time to spread either any type of nutrients. So from that, it's kind of stacking up to be kind of, as we get to soil temperatures being 6 degrees plus, low risk of rainfall events, and grass growth is starting to increase. And for the last 2-3 years, that has kind of been stacking up to be from the 1st of March onwards. And if we wanted in the spring, we wanted the majority of our slurry spread mainly before our scorching hot conditions come in. Like, so we'd be saying kind of from the 1st of March until probably the beginning of May, you could say. And the second question of that is, what's ideal for dribble bar? Look, it varies. Probably that the 5-6% dry matter should be fine as long as it's well agitated, and there's no bale wraps or basically long silage after getting wrapped up dragged into the tank.
And just finally there, what's the value of farmyard manure, and when is the best time to spread it on silage ground?
As regards farmyard manure, I don't have the value off the top of my head, but with slurry, I'd say David might have that figure off the top of his head better than I, but it's roughly the same as slurry in nutrient value. Might be a small bit less on either one of them. And when's the best time to spread it? I suppose, look, we want it to be rolled in ideally, so it probably wants to be earlier than March if possible. It wants to be light covers and the fields want to be rolled. So it's probably after a grazing event if it can be managed in the spring. If it can't be managed in the spring, then the dung might just have to be delayed until after our slurry application to replace our offtakes.
Thanks, Colm. That's it there, Paul. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks very much again, Colm. And I'll hand over to David.
Thanks very much, Paul. Hopefully you can see the slides there.
Yeah, it's up there now, David.
Yeah, super. Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to, I suppose, wrap up the session this evening and go through a little bit on fertiliser planning, set out some I suppose, a spring plan in terms of slurry and nitrogen for the first and second round up till, I suppose, the end of the first grazing round, which would be finishing up in the first week of April. And I suppose to start off this evening, I just want to bring to your attention, I suppose, the current fertiliser prices. You'll all be aware, but there may be some, I suppose, tuning in this evening that haven't really considered fertiliser yet, and it's on the agenda in the next week or so. One thing just to say there, it's important to be calculating fertiliser prices based on the euros per kilo of N, rather than the euros per ton. So really to look through them there, if we look at calcium ammonium nitrate can to start off with, there currently somewhere between 675 and 700, and when we break that down per euro per kilo of nitrogen, it's coming in at around 250. And it's worth noting that this time last year that was around 95 cent. So it's a significant hike in fertilizer prices. For urea, currently somewhere between 950 and 1,000 euro per ton. That's currently coming in around 206 per kilo of N. So quite a bit cheaper there if you can get your hands on urea. I know it's scarce at the moment. And then finally, protected urea, being the new kid in town, I suppose, also fairly competitive there at about 50 quid ahead of the urea price. It'll probably be scarce as well this year, but coming in there around 217 euro per kilo of N. Just to note there, based on Martin's presentation and Colin's presentation coming after him there, phosphorus and potassium have also increased in prices. So, you know, using your slurry is going to be critical this year. The one thing that hasn't increased is ground limestone, and probably the cheapest fertilizer that you'll buy in any year. If we move forward then and get into the fertilizer side of things, the fertilizer requirement by Grass, you'll all know, this is not new. The soil supply of fertilizer or of nitrogen, and also the grass demand for nitrogen, being the green line here, increases as the year goes on. And what we're trying to do with our fertilizer is fill the gap there between what the soil will supply and what the grass needs. And you can see there, that's anywhere between very, very little here at the start of the year and grows to somewhere in the region of about 2.5 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per day in terms of peak demand there, somewhere between April and May. And that's when we're cutting, we have closed for silage, and we're trying to put that back in the pit. However, I do want to draw your attention, the previous speakers, Colin in particular, has emphasized low soil temperature, high rainfall, and the effect that has on grass growth in the green line, and also nitrogen demand. And you can see there, nitrogen demand is very, very low out until around the 1st of March. So it stands to reason that we shouldn't be, I suppose, going out with high rates of slurry or high rates of fertilizer in that period. Small amount will keep it ticking over. And especially in a high price year like this, we certainly don't want to be putting out more than we need for fear that it might be lost. If we put soil temperature there and we look at apparent nitrogen recovery, so this is the amount, the percentage of the fertilizer that we put out that's recovered at the different soil temperatures. And if we look down here and we see where we're getting about 25% of the fertilizer that we put out recovered, it takes somewhere between 7 and 8 degrees Celsius in terms of soil temperature. So at the moment, we're running somewhere around between 5 and 6 degrees. So it stands to reason that we shouldn't be putting out high rates of fertilizer or slurry at this time of the year. A small amount is plenty, just to keep the thing ticking over. And if there is good weather in the weeks ahead, that you can capitalize on that. However, as we move along into the year, there's much more potential as the fertilizers or as the soil temperature begins to increase. And obviously then we're getting much better return on investment here in terms of nitrogen fertilizer. Just to bring you back to the pasture base side of the house and grass growth levels. So each week the grass growth levels are put out there on the pasture base figure or in the Farmer's Journal or elsewhere. And you can see there that currently in Wexford, Wicklow and Carlow, we have low levels of growth, somewhere between 4 and 5 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. And if we look at that in terms of nitrogen demand at the moment, we know it's going to be low based on the previous figure that I showed. However, how low is it? And what I've done here is I've calculated the amount of nitrogen needed for those growth rates for an entire week. And you can see there's less than a kilo to less than a kilo needed for the whole week in terms of demand to keep that level of grass growth going at the moment. Now, hopefully we get more mild weather and those growth rates begin to increase upwards and heading for 7-8 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. However, we must be conscious that there's a very low demand, and probably at those levels of grass growth, the soil itself can supply enough nitrogen to keep you taking over. I've totted it up here, and you can do this for your own farms when you use your grass growth measure. If you're in pasture base, you'll be able to do this very easily, as John has outlined in the first presentation. However, I've calculated the typical total nitrogen uptake up to the 1st of March on most grassland farms. And you can say that some fields are going to grow more than others. Certainly the low growing fields, those wetter fields or those north facing fields that don't warm up very quick are going to grow less and probably need less nitrogen demand. And obviously your best fields that are free draining with the best swards in them will need slightly more nitrogen. But on average, there's somewhere between 14 to 15 kilos of nitrogen uptake the whole way out from January to the 1st of March. So just again, reinforcing that we don't need a lot of nutrients, and you're better holding your nutrients and using them later on when they're going to give a better return in terms of grass growth. Okay, the final piece then, getting into spring fertiliser recommendations for grassland farms. If we take this through and we take the slurry first, in terms of the first round, we must maximize the benefits of slurry. I give you there a figure for 1,000 gallons of cattle slurry. Colin has given you more detail there in terms of different tank types. However, if we aim to go on the lowest grass covers, the last ones that you probably grazed on the farm, those covers that are less than 1,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare, those paddocks or those fields occupying about 40% of the farm, they're the first ones to hit with slurry. And probably no more than 2,000 gallons. I would say 1,500 gallons is probably plenty on those because of the low demand for nutrients. And those can be hit, I suppose, in the coming weeks. If we think about then moving forward, the next ones to hit, I suppose, as we get into mid-February and we begin to graze, we can follow the cows or follow the cattle as we're grazing there. And again, a low amount of slurry on those ones after grazing in mid-February. As we move forward, then we can begin to up the rate of slurry up around 2,500 gallons there for those that were grazing towards the end of February. And that's probably all the slurry that you'll get to on the grazing ground at that time, because we must make sure and keep enough slurry for the silage ground, and that silage ground will need about 3,000 gallons. So for the remainder of the farm there, probably there around mid-February, somewhere in the region of 29 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, or about 23 units will suffice where there's no slurry gone out. If we move into the second round then, in terms of March time, we know we're in better growth conditions, and we're certainly safer to be using nitrogen fertiliser at that point. So first of all, I'd say where we haven't put slurry, we should be considering a compound if needed, to supply some of the P and K. And then we're applying on the last graze area. There'll be less time in March because you'll be grazing into March, probably 35 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, somewhere around 28 to 30 units would be plenty on that ground in one split. And for the other part of the farm that you've grazed early on, somewhere in the region of 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare is probably plenty on those, about 40 units, and hit those in one or two splits as needs be. So finally then, some take-home messages. In the first round, there's lower demand, there's lower grass growth, so we need to keep nutrient levels low. Maximize the use of cattle slurry or other manures if you can get your hands on them to offset expensive fertilizer costs. Keep slurry applications low. Anybody going with an umbilical system, you know, tell the contractor or whatever that you want to put out as low as they can go with those umbilical systems. If you get enough freeboard in the tank to keep you going for the next month, there's no point in emptying the tank when grass growth levels are low. That is very valuable fertilizer for the year ahead. Apply fields with low grass covers first and then follow the cows after grazing. And on any land that's not getting slurry, probably 23 units per acre is plenty in terms of the first round of nitrogen. For the second round then, that will be coming in March, increasing demand for nitrogen as soil temperatures and grass growth increases, so we can up the rates a little bit. Consider a compound fertilizer where no slurry has been applied. Even though it might be expensive, it's well worth it. We don't want to let soil fertility slip. And I suppose for the rest, follow then with straight nitrogen, be it CAN or urea, whichever you can get your hands on. Hopefully there'll be some urea available out there, or protected urea even, in one or two splits in early March onwards. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that come in.
Thanks very much for that there, David. I'll hand you over there now to Kevin for any questions that have come in.
Yeah, no bother, Paul. The first question in there, David, is if I spread nitrogen in early February and it turns very cold, will the nitrogen value still be available for growth in March when the soil warms up?
All I'd say, I suppose, to answer that question, it's a good question. The earlier you go with chemical nitrogen, if it's not used, the more chance that some of it may be lost. So if we're going in late January, early February, and the weather are to be higher losses than if you were to hold off and put on some of that chemical nitrogen later on. What I would say there is, from about the 1st of March every year, it's relatively safe. Colin showed the weather patterns for the last couple of years, and they would, I suppose, stack up. We can get a lot of rain there in February. However, in March, you're into more growthy weather, and I suppose that sprint between the grass getting it or the environment getting it is much better stacked in terms of the grass.
Very good, David. I suppose another question in there is, how much losses does urea have in cool, dull weather? And do they differ for all conditions or just when it is dry and sunny?
Okay, another very good question. So urea would be our preference, I suppose, in early spring, our preferential nitrogen source in early spring. In terms of straight urea without the protection on it, it's best used in dull overcast weather, as the question has come in. Under those conditions, you're going to have the lowest losses. So what happens with urea is when it begins to break down under dry and very sunny conditions, basically that sun and that wind carry that nitrogen off. So it bakes the nitrogen off it as it begins to break down. With protected urea, that protection affords the ability to be able to spread the urea all year round, even in the middle of the summer, without the losses. So what I would say there is straight urea, yeah, dull weather. What I'd say there, the same thing for slurry, anybody that's still using a splash plate. When the wipers on the tractor are on intermittent, it's not raining, the ground conditions are good enough, but it's not a day that you're going to go to the beach.
And just another question in there, David, is I suppose since grass growth really takes off in mid-March, would it be better to keep as much slurry as I can to spread then?
Yeah, another very, very good observation, I suppose, there in terms of thinking about this year ahead, trying to offset chemical fertilizer prices. Spread some slurry early on just to keep you taking over and to get some nutrients out. That's fair enough. But yes, holding back as much slurry as you can until that March window will certainly pay dividends there in terms of maximising the benefits to slurry. The other thing that I will say on that is we should try to keep enough slurry held back for closing the silage ground, because the silage is probably the biggest nutrient demand or fertilizer demand in terms of the crops that you're growing on the farm.
That's it there, Paul. Yeah.
Okay. I just one question, just in relation to silage, there, David. Splitting your nitrogen for silage, is that recommended, or does it make any difference going out all the one day, or splitting it between, say, today and 3 weeks time?
Yeah, a good question, Paul. What I would say there is anybody putting slurry and then coming back up with a top of nitrogen, it probably pays to split and leave about 10 days between applying the slurry first, getting out your P and K. It's plenty in 3,000 gallons of fairly good cattle slurry. There's enough P and K for to grow the crop. You'll get about 25% of your nitrogen out as well at that point. That's enough to kick things off. And then coming back within probably 2 weeks, I would say 10 days to 2 weeks is probably ideal to let that first nitrogen be used from the slurry, and then you top it up in terms of how much nitrogen you need. What we don't want to do is delay it too long, because we'll end up with very rank grass going into the pit, which is very hard to ensoil. So you want to give enough time for that nitrogen to be used. And if we use a rule of thumb that we'll use about 2 units per day. So, if you're putting out somewhere in the region of 80 to 90 units, you're looking at somewhere in the region of 6 weeks to grow that out.
Okay.